Look closely at the 38th parallel. In our world, it's a tense line of barbed wire and concrete, a frozen ghost of the Cold War. But in this timeline, there is no wire. There are no guards. There is only a 500-mile score of vitrified sand and glowing dust, a sea of cobalt that screams with silent radiation. Here, the Korean War didn't end in an uneasy ceasefire. It ended in a sunrise that never went away. The year is 1951. The stakes couldn't be higher. History tells us that President Harry Truman made the most difficult decision of his career. He fired the legendary General Douglas MacArthur to prevent a global catastrophe, but history is a fragile thing. What if that letter of dismissal was never sent? What if, instead of being stripped of his command, MacArthur was handed the keys to the most terrifying arsenal in human history? This isn't just a story about a war that went hot. It's a descent into a dark timeline where the forgotten war became the last war. A world where one man's ego and a nation's desperation triggered a scorched earth apocalypse, turning a peninsula into a radioactive graveyard and changing the face of the planet forever. This is the world where MacArthur got his way. This is the nuclear Korean War. To understand how we reached the brink of nuclear fire, we must look back at the bitter winter of 1950. In our timeline, the Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, but there was nothing forgettable about the nightmare unfolding in the mountains of the North. Just months earlier, General Douglas MacArthur, the legendary Caesar of the Pacific, had executed a masterstroke at Incheon, shattering the North Korean People's Army and racing toward the Chinese border. He famously promised his troops they would be home by Christmas. He was dead wrong. On a freezing November night, the mountains began to scream. 300,000 Chinese soldiers, moving like ghosts under the cover of darkness to avoid American air power, poured across the Yalu River. It wasn't just a counterattack, it was a human avalanche. The UN forces, stretched thin and blinded by the cold, were caught in a brutal, sub-zero trap. In Washington, President Harry Truman was paralyzed by a terrifying reality. He sought a limited war, a surgical containment of communism that wouldn't provoke a global thermonuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. But MacArthur had no interest in limits. To him, there was no substitute for victory. He viewed Truman's restraint not as strategy, but as a betrayal of the men dying in the snow. The friction between the two men was a ticking time bomb, a clash between civilian caution and a general's ego. In our history, the frozen chosen was a miracle of resilience, where Marines fought their way out of the trap to live another day. But in this darker reality, the miracle never happens. A freak, relentless blizzard pins down the American air support for 72 hours. The perimeter at the chosen reservoir collapses under the sheer weight of Chinese numbers. The news reaching the Oval Office in early 1951 is catastrophic. The 1st Marine Division has been decimated and the 8th Army is in a total shattered rout toward the sea. The prospect of a Dunkirk on the Korean coast is no longer a fear. It is a certainty. For Truman, the political calculus shifts in a heartbeat. The limited war is dead, buried under the ice of the North. Faced with the total annihilation of his forces, the president realizes that conventional steel is no longer enough. To save the army, he must unlock the cage of the atom, April 11, 1951. In our timeline, this was the day the world breathed a sigh of relief as President Truman stripped the subordinate general of his command. But in this darker reality, the courier arriving at MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo isn't carrying a dismissal. He is carrying a black leather portfolio stamped with the highest level of executive clearance. Inside is the authorization for tactical employment. Truman, broken by the slaughter in the North and the looming collapse of the American position in Asia, has finally surrendered to the general's vision. MacArthur doesn't just have permission to defend his lines. He has been handed the keys to the sun. His strategy is as cold as the Siberian winds. He doesn't want to strike Beijing or Moscow, at least not yet. He intends to strike geography itself. MacArthur's plan for victory calls for the deployment of 30 to 50 atomic bombs, dropped in a relentless, synchronized wave across the neck of Manchuria. The objective is to sever the Korean peninsula from the Asian mainland, creating a cauterized wound that no army can bridge. The logistics of the apocalypse begin in the dead of night at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. The keystone of the Pacific transforms into a factory of nuclear doom. Under the glare of floodlights and the watchful eyes of armed guards, the silence is broken by the heavy, rhythmic clanking of hydraulic lifts. These aren't the primitive weapons of Hiroshima. These are Mark IV atomic bombs, refined, mass-produced killers with variable yields. Each 5-ton casing is gingerly hoisted into the cavernous bellies of modified B-29 superfortresses. The ground crews work in a state of grim, focused terror. They have been told this is a special tactical mission, but the lead-lined containers and the presence of the silver plate pilots tell a different story. As the silver wings of the bombers catch the first light of a bruised dawn, the engines roar to life, coughing blue-black smoke into the salt air. The pilots check their coordinates, the bridges of the Yalu River, the supply hubs of Ontung, and the mountain passes where the Chinese dragon breathes. The general's belt of fire is ready. The order has been signed, the bombs are loaded, and the 20th century is about to be split wide open. The sky over the Yalu River is a pale, freezing blue as the lead B-29 superfortress, a silver needle in the stratosphere, steadies its course. Below, the river sticks through the rugged borderland between China and North Korea, the vital artery through which 500,000 Chinese soldiers and their supplies flow. For months, UN pilots have pecked at these bridges with conventional iron bombs, only to see them repaired by thousands of laborers under the cover of night. But today, the rules of engagement have been incinerated. When the bay doors groan open, it isn't a stick of high explosives that falls. It is a single, blunt-nosed cylinder. In a heartbeat, the morning sun is eclipsed by a flash so bright it turns the cockpit glass into a mirror of white fire. A moment later, the bridges at Sinuiju and the massive supply hubs at Ontung simply cease to exist. They aren't just broken, they are atomized, transformed into a rising pillar of radioactive dust that dwarfs the surrounding mountains. The tactical payoff is immediate and absolute. In one morning, the umbilical cord connecting the Chinese mainland to the front lines is severed. the massive Chinese volunteer army in the south is suddenly an island, cut off from food, fuel, and reinforcements. But MacArthur's vision goes beyond simple destruction. This isn't just a strike, it is the birth of the Sea of Cobalt, as the subsequent waves of bombers sweep across the 300-mile neck of the peninsula. They don't just drop warheads. They release a fine, invisible rain of radioactive waste, the byproduct of the atomic age. MacArthur's plan is to lay down a belt of cobalt-60, a substance so lethal that it creates a permanent, uninhabitable no-man's land. There is no gore, no screaming to be heard from 30,000 feet. Only the terrifying realization that the Earth itself has been turned into a weapon. For the first time since the ashes of Nagasaki cooled, the nuclear taboo has been shattered, not as a desperate end to a world war, but as a tactical convenience on a Tuesday morning. The Korean Peninsula is no longer a battlefield. It is a laboratory for the end of the world. The geography of the Korean Peninsula is no longer defined by mountains and rivers, but by the cold, invisible math of isotopes. MacArthur's cobalt belt isn't a wall of stone. It is a 60-mile wide strip of salted earth, poisoned by cobalt-60. Unlike a standard atomic blast that dissipates over weeks, a cobalt-salted weapon is designed for maximum persistence. With a half-life of over 5 years, the land doesn't just burn, it becomes a permanent furnace of gamma radiation. Any human, animal, or plant that attempts to cross this line is subjected to a lethal dose of invisible fire within hours. It is the ultimate siege work, a moat that cannot be bridged, a wall that cannot be scaled, and a border that kills without a single soldier standing guard. The geopolitical impact is immediate and horrifying. South of the Yalu River, nearly 500,000 Chinese and North Korean soldiers are suddenly trapped. They are the lost armies, cut off from their command in Beijing and Pyongyang by a radioactive wasteland they cannot retreat through. To their front is the might of the UN forces. To their rear is a glowing abyss. Supplies of rice, ammunition, and medicine vanish overnight. Within weeks, the once formidable People's Volunteer Army begins to wither, not from combat, but from starvation and the creeping sickness of the fallout drifting south from the belt. But radiation does not respect the strategic maps of generals. As the dust from the 50 atomic strikes rises into the stratosphere, the prevailing winds catch the black rain. The radioactive plume doesn't stay confined to the 38th parallel. It drifts east and north, carrying the invisible poison toward the Soviet port of Vladivostok and the crowded streets of Tokyo. In Japan, a nation still reeling from the trauma of Hiroshima and Nagasaki only 6 years prior, the Geiger counters begin to click in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Black soot falls on the fishing fleets of the Sea of Japan, and the Korean solution quickly becomes a global contagion. MacArthur has achieved his tactical objective. He has severed the peninsula, but in doing so, he has poisoned the well of international diplomacy and signaled to the world that the era of limited war is dead. The shadow of the Cobalt Belt is growing, and it is heading straight for the heart of the Kremlin. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere is thick with more than just tobacco smoke. It is thick with the scent of an ending. Reports from Vladivostok are catastrophic. The black rain is falling on Soviet soil, and the Geiger counters are screaming. For Joseph Stalin, this is no longer a localized border dispute. It is a direct existential threat. The Americans haven't just cleared a peninsula, they have demonstrated a terrifying new doctrine, the use of the ultimate weapon as common tactical ordnance. Stalin faces a choice that will define the survival of the human species. If he does nothing, he signals to the West that the Soviet Union can be bullied into submission by atomic fire. If he retaliates, he risks the total annihilation of the motherland. In this timeline, the greatest danger isn't just the bombs, it's the silence. In 1951, there is no red phone. There is no hotline between the White House and the Kremlin. That won't be established for another 12 years in our world. Here, every diplomatic cable takes hours to translate, encrypt, and transmit. In that vacuum of communication, paranoia becomes the only logic. Truman's State Department tries to send reassurances that the strikes are limited to the Korean theater, but the messages arrive late or are dismissed as American deception. The tension snaps not in the Pacific, but in the heart of Europe. Soviet commanders in East Berlin, witnessing the American escalation in Asia, assume a global first strike against the Eastern Bloc is imminent. They don't wait for Stalin's final word. Along the Elbe River, the engines of the Soviet Third Guards tank army roar to life. Thousands of T-34 tanks begin a massive, unannounced mobilization toward the Fulda Gap. In response, NATO forces scramble to their battle stations, their fingers hovering over the triggers of their own tactical nuclear shells. The world holds its breath as the Cold War turns white-hot on two continents simultaneously. In Washington, the limited war Truman fought so hard to maintain has vanished. In Moscow, Stalin retreats to his dacha, convinced that the final struggle between capitalism and communism has begun. The Korean War has successfully been won by MacArthur's definition, but the price is a planet teetering on the edge of a total nuclear exchange. The shadow of the Cobalt Belt has stretched across the globe, turning the 1950s into a decade of leaden fear, where the next sunrise might be the last. While the borders of Europe bristled with steel and the black rain fell over the Soviet East, the heart of America was undergoing a radical, irreversible transformation. In our history, Douglas MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome, but was eventually eclipsed by the political machinery of Washington. In this timeline, he returns as a nuclear Caesar. He is the man who did the unthinkable to achieve the impossible, the general who tamed the Red Dragon with the fire of the gods. To a public terrified of a long, grinding stalemate, MacArthur isn't a reckless warmonger. He is a savior who brought the boys home by any means necessary. This nuclear mandate shatters the political landscape of the 1952 election. President Truman, the man who tried to restrain the fire, is cast as a weak-willed bureaucrat who nearly invited a global catastrophe through hesitation. MacArthur doesn't just influence the election, he haunts it. Whether he takes the Oval Office himself or acts as the kingmaker for a hardline successor, the result is the same. The limited war philosophy is dead. In its place rises a new American doctrine, the belief that nuclear weapons are not a last resort, but a primary tool of diplomacy and tactical warfare. But this victory carries a hidden corrosive price. To maintain a world held together by atomic threats, the United States transforms into a permanent garrison state. The concept of atomic security begins to supersede the Constitution. Civil liberties, once the pride of the Republic, are now viewed as dangerous luxuries that a nation under the constant shadow of the mushroom cloud can no longer afford. The emergency powers granted during the Korean crisis are never rescinded. They become the new foundation of federal law. The FBI's reach extends into every classroom and living room, hunting for radiological subversives who dare to question the morality of the Cobalt Belt. The military-industrial complex isn't just a part of the economy. It becomes the economy, fueled by the endless production of tactical warheads and the construction of massive, deep-earth bunkers. The vibrant, optimistic 1950s we remember, the era of rock and roll and suburban expansion, are replaced by a leaden era of suspicion and militarization. In this dark timeline, America has won the war, but in doing so, it has begun to lose its soul to the very weapons it used to secure its triumph. The victor is now a prisoner of its own arsenal, a society that has traded its freedom for the cold, hard certainty of the shield. As the calendar turns to the 1960s, the map of East Asia looks less like a political chart and more like a medical diagram of a terminal patient. In our world, the 1960s represented a period of reconstruction and the beginning of the miracle on the Han River. In this timeline, there is no miracle. There is only the dead zone. The Korean Peninsula is no longer a place of nations. It is a fractured, cauterized limb of the Asian continent, where the demilitarized zone should have been, a line of fences and guard towers. There is now something far more absolute. It is a 50-mile-wide belt of radioactive cobalt salt, a shimmering, lifeless wasteland that stretches from the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan. This is MacArthur's Sea of Cobalt realized. No soldiers patrol this border because no human can survive within it for more than an hour. There are no landmines, no barbed wire, and no dogs. There is only the terrifying silent hum of a Geiger counter and the eerie blue glow of Cherenkov radiation that illuminates the horizon at night. This radioactive barrier hasn't just divided the North from the South. It has effectively erased the heart of the peninsula. The once fertile valleys are now dust bowls of irradiated topsoil. To the north of the belt, the remnants of the Chinese-backed forces have retreated into deep mountain complexes, ruling over a starving, scorched population that lives in a state of perpetual subterranean siege. To the south, the Republic of Korea is a hollowed-out garrison state, its capital of Seoul a crumbling ghost of its former self, its people living under the constant shadow of the Great Death to their north. The humanitarian cost is beyond calculation. In the wake of the 1951 strikes, the peninsula didn't just suffer casualties, it suffered an exodus. Millions of refugees, poisoned by fallout and stripped of their ancestral lands, have been forced into a destabilized China and a struggling, overcrowded Japan. Manchuria has become a sprawling series of tent cities and lawless border zones, straining the resources of a Maoist government that is itself reeling from the nuclear beheading of its military infrastructure. In Japan, the arrival of millions of displaced Koreans has sparked social unrest and a resurgence of the very ethnic tensions that characterized the colonial era, threatening to tear the island nation apart from within. By 1965, the Korean Peninsula has become a permanent frozen zone, a term used by geographers to describe a land that is not only politically dead, but biologically stagnant. The world has looked away, able to bear the sight of the wound MacArthur carved into the earth. The peninsula is no longer a flashpoint of the Cold War. It is a monument to the terrifying efficiency of tactical nuclear warfare. It is a place where time has stopped, where the wind carries the scent of ozone and salt, and where the dream of a unified, prosperous Korea has been buried under 50 miles of glowing, lethal dust. The Korean solution has worked, but at the cost of the very land it was meant to save, leaving a scar on the planet that will outlast every ideology that created it. The radioactive silence of the 38th parallel didn't just signal the end of a war. It signaled the end of the era of restraint. By using the atom as a tactical sledgehammer, the United States hadn't just won a campaign. It had broken the most important unspoken rule in human history. MacArthur hadn't just used the bomb, he had domesticated it. In our world, the nuclear taboo kept these weapons in their silos for decades. In this timeline, that taboo died in the craters of the Yalu River. By the early 1960s, the Korean solution became the new gold standard for military doctrine. To the burgeoning powers of the Cold War, the lesson was clear. You don't need a million-man army if you have a dozen tactical warheads. The nuclear weapon was no longer a city killer reserved for the end of the world. It was simply heavy artillery with a longer shadow. This shift sparked a frantic, unregulated scramble for proliferation. If the Americans could use them to clear a peninsula, why couldn't everyone else use them to settle an old grudge? The results were catastrophic and frequent. The 1960s and 70s, which in our history were defined by proxy wars and tense diplomacy, became in this timeline an era of limited nuclear exchanges. We see the sands of glass war in 1967, where a desperate regional conflict in the Middle East ended not with a ceasefire, but with the tactical sterilization of the Sinai Peninsula to halt an advancing tank column. We see the 1971 Kashmir exchange, where the Himalayan peaks were crowned with mushroom clouds as India and Pakistan bypassed decades of conventional buildup for the instant, glowing finality of the atom. In this dark reality, the news doesn't report on the threat of nuclear war. It reports on the latest tactical incident. The world has become a patchwork of little Koreas, where every regional power maintains its own sea of cobalt to keep its neighbors at bay. The international community no longer gasps at the sight of a mushroom cloud on the evening news. They simply check the wind patterns to see where the fallout will land this time. The Korean solution hasn't brought peace. It has brought a world where the unthinkable has become the routine, and where the threshold for Armageddon is lowered with every passing year. This normalized devastation birthed what historians in this timeline call the generation of the shadow. For those born after 1951, the nuclear flash isn't a harbinger of the end times. It's a weather report. Popular culture in this world doesn't dream of a digital frontier or a globalized utopia. Instead, It is obsessed with lead-lined basements, iodine tablets, and the grim mathematics of fallout decay. Art is nihilistic, music is discordant, and the collective psyche of humanity is permanently fractured by the knowledge that any border dispute can end in a blinding white light. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this timeline is the void where a vibrant culture should be. In our world, the Republic of Korea rose from the ashes to become a global titan, a miracle on the Han River. But in this reality, that miracle was smothered in its crib by MacArthur's cobalt dust. There is no neon-lit soul pulsing with life. There is no King, no LG, no high-tech revolution that redefined the 21st century. The infectious energy of K-pop never reached global ears because the voices that would have sung it were never born or were scattered as refugees across a destabilized Orient. The Korean Peninsula is not a cultural powerhouse. It is a silent, glowing graveyard, a cautionary tale that the world stopped listening to decades ago. Tension has become the oxygen of the 1970s. People live in the constant shadow of the second sun, the terrifyingly common sight of a tactical strike seen from 100 miles away. We have traded our dreams of a connected world for a fortress mentality. The global economy is stagnant, choked by radioactive borders and the collapse of trans-Pacific trade. As the calendar turns toward the 1980s, the psychological fatigue of this atomic peace is reaching a breaking point. The world is tired of living in the shadow, and in the halls of power in Washington and Moscow, the men with their fingers on the buttons are becoming just as desperate and just as paranoid as the people they rule. By the dawn of the 1980s, the atomic peace is no longer a peace at all. It is a state of advanced terminal paranoia. In Moscow, the aging Soviet leadership looks at a NATO alliance that has spent 30 years perfecting the art of tactical nuclear warfare, a doctrine born in the radioactive craters of North Korea. To the Soviets, the Americans aren't just rivals. They are arsonists who have proven time and again that they will burn the house down to win a single room. Because the taboo of nuclear use was shattered in 1951, the USSR no longer believes in the possibility of a conventional war. Every border skirmish, every diplomatic insult is seen through the lens of an impending mushroom cloud. The tension reaches its breaking point in the autumn of 1983. A sensor malfunction, a stray weather balloon, or perhaps just a glitch in an overworked, lead-shielded computer system. The exact cause is lost to the chaos that follows. What matters is the blip on a radar screen in a bunker deep beneath the Kremlin. In our world, cool heads and a healthy fear of the unthinkable stayed the hand of the men in charge. But in this timeline, the unthinkable has been routine for a generation. There is no moral friction left to slow the gears of war. The Korean solution has taught every general that nuclear weapons are simply larger bullets. The Soviet response is reflexive and brutal. Before the error can even be verified, the order is given. A limited barrage of tactical warheads is launched toward the Fulda Gap to blunt what the Soviets believe is an incoming NATO invasion. Within minutes, the sky over Central Europe is torn apart by the same blinding flashes that silenced the Korean Peninsula 3 decades earlier. It isn't the total global annihilation of 1,000 ICBMs, not yet. It is something arguably more tragic, a controlled exchange that leaves the heart of Europe a shattered, irradiated ruin. As the black rain begins to fall over the smoldering remains of Frankfurt and Prague, the world finally realizes the true legacy of Douglas MacArthur's ambition. His quick fix in 1951 wasn't a shortcut to victory. It was a 30-year slow-motion suicide for Western civilization. The Sea of Cobalt wasn't just a border in Asia. It was a poison that had finally reached the throat of the world, proving that once you normalize the apocalypse, you can never truly turn back the clock. While the fires of a fractured Europe dominate the headlines of the 1980s, the original wound on the face of the earth, the Korean Peninsula, offers a much more silent, much more permanent kind of horror. In this timeline, the Cobalt Belt is no longer a military theory. It is a geological fact. For 30 years, the most brilliant minds in the world haven't been focused on personal computing or space exploration, but on the grim mathematics of isotope decay and radioactive migration. The data is catastrophic. MacArthur's original plan called for a barrier that would remain lethal for 60 to 120 years, but he failed to account for the way nature absorbs and redistributes poison. The Yalu River, once a vital artery for the region, has become a conveyor belt of death. Every spring, the snowmelt from the mountains carries a fresh slurry of irradiated silt down into the valleys, spreading the Sea of Cobalt far beyond the original strike zones. The Sea of Japan is no longer just a bounty of life. It is a shimmering, sterile graveyard. Massive dead zones stretch for hundreds of miles, where the current has pooled radioactive runoff, poisoning the fish stocks that once fed millions in Japan and China. Land, the transformation is even more haunting. This isn't the vibrant, reclaimed wilderness of our world's DMZ. In this dark timeline, the dead zone is literal. The flora of the northern peninsula has undergone a terrifying metamorphosis. Forests of pine and oak have been replaced by stunted, necrotic scrubland. Trees grow in agonizing, spiraling shapes, their DNA shattered by decades of constant bombardment from the soil. There are no birds in the sky over the Yalu. There is only the wind howling through a landscape of gray, calcified skeletons. Historians and scientists of this era have coined a new term to describe the 20th century, the age of ecocide. In our history, the Cold War was defined by the fear of what might happen. In this world, it is defined by what was allowed to happen. The intentional destruction of an entire ecosystem as a tactical maneuver has set a precedent that cannot be ignored. The realization has finally set in. The land is not just temporarily hot. The isotopes have migrated into the deep water tables, contaminating the very foundations of the peninsula. MacArthur's quick fix didn't just win a war, it evicted humanity from the land for the next 10,000 years. The unfairness of it is a weight that the entire world must carry. A thriving culture, a storied history, and an entire people have been erased, not by a natural disaster, but by a choice made in a room in 1951. The Korean Peninsula has become a permanent monument to human arrogance, a glowing, silent reminder that when you use the earth as a weapon, the earth eventually stops sustaining you. As the 20th century draws to a close, the Cobalt Belt stands as a jagged, glowing scar that ensures the 21st century will not be an era of progress, but one of survival in a world that is slowly, inevitably turning toxic. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world of this timeline is a distorted, unrecognizable mirror of our own. It is a world that never truly left the 1950s. While our modern era is defined by the seamless flow of information and global commerce, this alternate 2024 is a high-tech garrison state, stagnant, militarized, and paralyzed by a permanent state of emergency. There was no Silicon Valley revolution here. The vast majority of human ingenuity and capital was siphoned into the refinement of atomic peacemakers, small tactical nuclear warheads that now line every major border from the Rhine to the Himalayas. The globalized trade that defines our prosperity is a ghost in this world. There are no massive container ships moving freely across the Pacific. Instead, trade is conducted via heavily armored convoys that must navigate around vast, radioactive no-go zones. The Korean Peninsula, which in our world is a hub of industry and culture, is a 500-mile wide void. All air and sea traffic must take 1,000-mile detours to avoid the drifting isotopes of the Cobalt Belt. There is no Made in Korea on the back of a smartphone because there is no Korea. There is only the zone. The cultural psyche is frozen. In a world where a nuclear exchange is seen as a legitimate tactical opening, the optimism of the space age or the digital revolution never took root. Fear is the primary global export. Children in this timeline don't dream of exploring the stars. They learn to calibrate Geiger counters before they learn to ride bicycles. The Korean solution didn't just end a war. It ended the very concept of a rules-based international order, replacing it with a nuclear mandate where the strongest simply erase the problems they cannot solve. As we look toward the horizon where the vibrant cities of Seoul and Pyongyang should be, we see no lights. There is only a low, sickly violet luminescence hugging the earth, a phenomenon the locals call the MacArthur light. It is a beautiful, terrifying glow that serves as the final vision of this timeline, a world that is high-tech yet primitive, powerful yet terminally ill. This is the 21st century that might have been a century defined not by the light of human progress, but by the lingering radioactive afterglow of a single catastrophic choice. The what if reaches its grim conclusion here in a world that traded its future for a scorched earth victory. The violet glow of the Cobalt Belt fades. The sirens of the garrison state fall silent. The nightmare of the Korean solution dissolves into the setic of history. Because in our world, this didn't happen. On the morning of April 11, 1951, the trajectory of the 20th century was decided not by a nuclear launch, but by a piece of paper. President Harry S. Truman, sitting in the Oval Office, faced a choice that would define his legacy and the fate of billions. General Douglas MacArthur, the legendary hero of the Pacific, was publicly challenging the administration's policy of limited war. He was bypassed the chain of command, sending letters to Congress and the press, demanding the right to strike Chinese bases and use the ultimate weapon to achieve total victory. He wanted the atomic bombs. He wanted the scorched earth. But Truman saw what MacArthur refused to acknowledge, that using the bomb as tactical artillery would ignite a global inferno. He understood that if the nuclear taboo were broken once, it would be broken forever. He also recognized a fundamental threat to the American experiment, the risk of a military leader dictating foreign policy over the civilian government. At 1 a.m., a press release was issued that shocked the nation and the world. Truman had fired MacArthur. He relieved the nuclear Caesar of his command for failing to respect the authority of the president. It was one of the most politically courageous, yet deeply unpopular decisions in American history. MacArthur returned to the United States to massive ticker tape parades and a hero's welcome. While Truman was burned in effigy across the country, his approval ratings plummeting to near record lows. Yet, Truman remained resolute. He would later reflect that his primary duty was to prevent a Third World War, famously stating that he fired MacArthur because the general would not respect the authority of the president, adding that the goal was to keep the conflict from spreading into a global catastrophe. By choosing the difficult, agonizing stalemate over the catastrophic shortcut of nuclear escalation, Truman ensured that the nuclear weapon remained a tool of last resort, not a battlefield convenience. He chose a world of cold tension over a world of radioactive ashes. This single act of restraint preserved the future we currently inhabit. Instead of a 50-mile wide belt of radioactive salt, look at the soul of today. Look at the Han River, reflecting a skyline of glass and light that rivals any city on the planet. Instead of a generation of the shadow living in a garrison state, we have a global culture defined by South Korean innovation, art, and resilience. This is the miracle on the Han River, a reality that could never have existed if MacArthur's Sea of Cobalt had been realized. The real DMZ is often viewed as a tragic symbol of a divided people, a frozen remnant of the Cold War. But in the shadow of the nightmare we've just explored, that stalemate reveals itself as something else, a masterpiece of restraint. It was a victory of the difficult, grinding peace over the seductive, easy explosion. It was the moment the world decided that some prices are simply too high to pay for total victory. By refusing to break the nuclear taboo, Truman and the leaders of 1951 ensured that the 20th century would not be the last century of human progress. History is usually measured by the wars that were fought, but perhaps it should be measured more by the catastrophes that were averted. We live in a world where the Korean Peninsula still breathes, where the Yalu River still flows clean, and where the nuclear shadow has not yet eclipsed our future. We owe a debt to the figures who chose the heavy burden of an unpopular stalemate over the catastrophic glory of a radioactive sunset. Because of that choice, the violet glow of the cobalt belt remains where it belongs, in the dark corners of our imagination, and never in our sky. Thankfully, in our world, the lights of soul are still burning bright.